The Egyptian gods are some of Yu-Gi-Oh's most iconic monsters, and I've talked about them a lot on this channel over the years. One thing that I've always wondered though was what if they had their anime and manga effects? Would that make them more viable at tournaments, or would they still struggle? Today we're going to look at their most powerful effects from the show that could help them out in the actual card game. Now, the Egyptian god anime effects haven't always been consistent throughout the years, but I've narrowed it down to the most important ones for today's discussion. Let's start off by talking about some of their shared abilities that they didn't get in the TCG. In the show, they are unaffected by most effects that would remove them from your side of the field, and they cannot be destroyed by the card effects of non-god cards. These are by far some of the most important effects that the Egyptian gods in the actual card game are missing, and it's no surprise that they would make a big difference. Specifically, I think that these protection effects would help out Slifer a lot because the floodgate ability on it is pretty good, so it would be a lot more powerful if your opponent couldn't out it with spell, trap, or monster effects. With Ra, this would make it significantly easier to OTK your opponent through their interruptions. Obelisk did see some competitive experimentation between 2011 and 2013 for being a big monster that couldn't be targeted, so obviously if you added on top of that it's unaffected by card effects, it would have been a lot better. Another anime effect that's kind of weird is that their effects are treated as attacks as well. I'm not really sure if that would matter in real Yu-Gi-Oh, but it would mean that if you attack with one of the Egyptian gods, your opponent could use a card like Mirror Force to destroy your monsters. Also, in the anime, only chosen duelists are allowed to even play these cards. You're supposed to have a link to the distant past. And obviously that would be difficult and maybe impossible to translate to the actual cards, but it would have been pretty interesting if they gave these out as prize cards and the only people that could play them were the people that won them. And I'm not really sure how they would put this on the actual cards, but in the anime there is a hierarchy of Egyptian gods. Slifer and Obelisk cannot affect Ra with their effects. And while that doesn't matter in the current state of Yu-Gi-Oh because people aren't really playing these cards, there is an alternate reality where these cards all get their broken effects and then suddenly that hierarchy matters a lot. Moving on, let's talk about the individual effects that these Egyptian god cards have in the anime. Slifer's effect is honestly pretty close to its TCG card effect, but there is one key difference that is worth mentioning, and that's that it also works when monsters are summoned in defense mode, and in that case it reduces the opponent's monster's defense by 2000 and then it destroys it if it hits 0. And that might not sound like a huge boost, but in the TCG when people play against Slifer, one of the most common ways to deal with it is to just special summon monsters in defense mode. By letting Slifer deal with monsters that are summoned in either position, it would make it significantly harder to out using monsters, and of course if it also was unaffected by card effects on top of that, Slifer would be quite formidable. For Obelisk's anime effect, you have a quick effect with two different good options. During either player's turn, while Obelisk is in attack position, the player contribute two other monsters that they control to activate one of these effects. First, Obelisk can go to infinity attack, and then it can attack any number of monsters that your opponent controls. If your opponent does still have life points after these attacks though, the Obelisk does go back to 4000. The other option is just Regeki. It destroys all monsters your opponent controls. It's difficult to guess what these effects would look like if they were printed on a real card, but I would guess that the first option would only be activatable during the battle phase, while perhaps the second option would only work in the main phase. With the effect to go to infinity attack, it would pretty much mean that your opponent couldn't enter the battle phase with any attack position monsters while Obelisk was on the board. The Regeki effect is actually on the legal version of Obelisk, but it can't be used on the opponent's turn, and for some reason Obelisk can't attack the turn that you activate it. If these effects were on Obelisk when it released in 2010, it absolutely would have been a force at tournaments, and even by modern standards it'd be a really annoying card to play against. Finally, we have the Winged Dragon of Ra, which is quite convoluted, not only because it's missing a bunch of effects compared to the anime, but also because it can be summoned in multiple different forms. In the anime, the attack and defense of Ra are increased by the combined attack and defense of the monsters that you attributed to summon it. This effect was later added on to the card Ancient Chant. There are many Ra support cards that feature some of the effects that we're going to talk about today, but it would be better if it was printed on the actual card. For a long time, it was pretty frustrating to try and play Ra even in a casual deck because it seemed like the two effects of it were at odds with each other. The attack boosting effect on the real card puts you to 100 life points, which makes it pretty difficult to pay 1000 to destroy monsters your opponent controls. If If Ra always gained the attack of what you tributed, you wouldn't have to pay down to 100 life points to make it have a lot of attack points, and that would leave life points available to pop monsters your opponent controlled. Ra's sphere mode is pretty different from how it worked in the show. In the show, it was just a form that the Winged Dragon of Ra took when it was tribute summoned until you said the correct chant to unlock all of its abilities. Obviously, the real sphere mode doesn't require the controller to say an ancient chant, but at least it does have an effect that allows you to summon Ra, which is pretty on theme. On the real card, Ra cannot be special summoned, but in the show, it could be special summoned in multiple different forms. One of the modes is just regular Ra, but it has some bonus effects when it's special summoned, so you can pay all of your life points to increase the attack and defense just like you could if you normal summon it, but also you can tribute monsters that you control to increase the attack and defense of Ra once again. And then after it does that, it can attack all of your opponent's monsters and attack directly afterwards. That's pretty strong, and it's kind of like a reverse engineered version of the normal summon effect because you special summon it and then tribute monsters you control to gain even more attack. But it's optional, so if you don't want to, you can just increase the attack and defense by how many life points you pay. The support card Millennium Revelation does at least let you special summon the Ra using Monster Reborn, but it doesn't get any of these bonus abilities. Being able to attack all of your opponent's monsters as well as directly after that is a ridiculous effect, and it makes sense why it's not on the card. The other form is the Egyptian God Phoenix, which has a number of powerful effects. The Egyptian God Phoenix cannot be destroyed by battle, and it is unaffected by all card effects. You take 0 battle damage from battles involving it, and its attack cannot be negated. When the Egyptian God Phoenix battles an opponent's monster, you can pay 1000 life points to destroy that monster at the start of the damage step. Unlike all of the other Egyptian God cards that have been printed, this one actually does still have the unaffected by card effects protection. They also buffed the monster removal effect. Not only do you not have to attack to trigger it, but also it doesn't destroy the monster, it sends it, which is great. Immortal Phoenix doesn't have the battle protection, but that's not really a big deal because it does have 4000 attack. The biggest downside of Immortal Phoenix compared to the one in the anime is that it has a really bad summoning condition. It can only be special summoned using its own effect. You can't bring it out with cards like Monster Reborn, and for it to trigger, it has to already be in your graveyard when a Winged Dragon of Ra on your field is sent to the graveyard. For most of its lifespan, the Immortal Phoenix didn't see any experimentation, even in the more casual Ra decks. It was just that inconsistent. Eventually though, years later, they did print the True Sun God, a Ra support card that makes summoning Immortal Phoenix a lot easier. With this card, you can send it and a Winged Dragon of Ra you control to the graveyard to then send an Immortal Phoenix from your deck to the graveyard, which then immediately triggers because the Ra just left the field. Even if the True Sun God does help you summon Immortal Phoenix without too much setup, it obviously still would have been better if the Winged Dragon of Ra card just could take on multiple forms. Now that we've gone through the important anime effects that the Egyptian God cards are missing, I think it's safe to say that they would have been a lot more broken if they had even some of these. If you remember, the first playable Egyptian God cards were released around 2010 and 2011, so clearly they couldn't have printed them with all of these broken effects, but I feel like there probably was a better middle ground between what we got and what the anime effects were. I really like the modern support cards that they've given the Egyptian gods, but even with those, it feels like they're always trying to make up for how the actual effects aren't strong enough. The Slifer Trap is insanely powerful, but it requires a bit of setup. The Ra support is crazy, but even with all of that, you are still kind of playing an inconsistent OTK deck, and Obelisk has gotten support, but it's nowhere near the level of Slifer or Ra. I've brought this up before, but I really think one of the coolest things that they could do would be to print Egyptian God Link monsters that have some of these anime effects. Alternatively, they could print a bunch of new support cards for all of them to try to make them a more playable strategy, kind of like those recently revealed Exodia support cards that I talked about a few months ago. Anyway, that is all for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you're interested in learning more about the Egyptian gods in the TCG format, make sure to check out some of the videos that I'm going to link at the end of this one. I'll catch you guys later though. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.